Hi everyone, thanks for being here today. My name is Kasia Duellman. I am the Extension Seed Potato Specialist based in Idaho Falls. My specialty is plant pathology, so I focus on the potato pathogens that affect tubers. So my audience today in my mind was the beginner. So I'm just going to build a foundation, build on what Eric's presented very well in terms of integrated pest management and what Pam talked about with weed management. So my section should be fairly short, and hopefully we'll have time at the end for some questions. So I'll just cover the basics. This is Plant Disease Management 101. So there's a few things we need to learn about in terms of terminology and what we mean when we talk about plant disease and the causes. What the disease triangle is, you'll know what that is by the end of the session. And we'll go through a generic disease cycle, which is something you need to understand, similar to what Eric had mentioned with insect life cycles, understanding where in that life cycle of the insect, what can you disrupt to manage that insect. And the same concept applies to disease. We'll talk about disease diagnosis very briefly and how important that is to know your enemy. And then I have one slide on the principles of disease management. So we'll see how all of this ties together. So what is plant disease? There's a bunch of different definitions out there. Some I like, some I don't. This one's kind of broad. Any malfunctioning of host cells and tissue from an irritation by either a pathogen or something in the environment. So we're going to go with a really broad definition, but I'm going to focus today on just the pathogenic side of disease. Over here on the little diagram, this nice little schematic, there's different types of symptoms. This is not an exhaustive list of symptoms, but we have spots, blights, blotches, wilts, galls, leaf rolls. There's many others too. The types of diseases that I'm going to focus on, or that when I think about disease, I think about the types of diseases on the left of the screen, the infectious diseases caused by things like fungi, bacteria, viruses, nematodes. But there's other things, what we consider the non-infectious diseases, that are also important, especially when you're trying to diagnose a problem. So there are things to be aware of, like plants growing at the wrong temperature can cause purpling in the plant. I had Burbanks this last summer in 2021 that I couldn't distinguish them from my huckleberry golds in my plot because they were purpling because of the cold weather. Wrong soil moisture, too much, too little, too much light, not enough light. Usually not enough light is something we struggle with, especially with things like smoke. Lack of oxygen can cause symptoms in tubers, for example. Air pollution, that's a funny one. That is something that, coming from the upper Midwest where we had the Great Lakes and acid rain, and I think it was burning coal. And they've implemented strategies to minimize the acid that goes out. And also ozone causes symptoms, believe it or not, on plants. I haven't seen it here in Idaho, but I have seen it here and there in North Dakota. So anyway, there's a bunch of different factors that can look like disease but aren't. Back to the types of plant pathogens, I wanted to throw this in there just to give you an idea of scale of these pathogens that cause the pathogenic diseases. This is a diagram of a plant cell. Plant cells, of course, are microscopic, so this is blown up many, many times. And here's the head of a nematode invading that plant cell, so it's fairly big. Here's a strand of a fungus. It's a little bit smaller, but that's invading the cell. Let's see, here's a little bacterium. You can still see it in the cell, it's pretty visible, and then somewhere in there, right here, this tiny little strand right here is the relative size of something like a plant virus. So that gives you some idea of the scale of these organisms that we're dealing with. All of them in this picture are microscopic. You won't see a single individual with your naked eye. So usually, when you're diagnosing a plant problem, a lab test may be required. So the disease triangle itself is a concept that you'll hear, when you go to a plant pathology session at Potato Conference or whatever commission conference that you go to. And it's a very basic concept. At its very basic level, the disease triangle just means there's 3 things that are needed for disease, a minimum of 3 things that are needed to cause disease. There are other things that can affect the severity of disease, like human activity and time. But these three things are fundamental to getting some level of disease. And the disease triangle is just a measure of how much disease you have. So here's a triangle that has, it's nice and big. That means it had a great environment that was conducive for disease. It had the pathogen was present, and it had a susceptible host. And all those things aligned perfectly well to create this area in this triangle. And if you manipulate any side of this triangle, any leg, if you shorten that leg on any side, you're going to have less disease. Like if I cut disease down, this is the total, representing the total amount of your environmental factors contributing to disease. If I cut that down to here, then my total disease is much smaller. It's this much smaller area. So that's the concept of the disease triangle. And when we think about plant disease management, we're thinking about what on this triangle can we influence or manipulate to minimize the size of the amount of that disease. I'm not going to go into specific diseases. This is just a general concept to apply to any disease that you encounter. And that brings me to the disease cycle. When you're managing plant diseases, the other thing you want to think about is where in the pathogen side of the triangle, where in that disease cycle can you disrupt that pathogen. So a general disease cycle generally has your dissemination of the pathogen into the susceptible host plant, and then it penetrates the host plant, it infects it, it invades it, gets inside the intercellular tissues, and then it starts reproducing and more spores get released, and that can happen in the same growing season over and over again. That's what we call secondary cycles. Not every disease does that, so it's really important to know if your disease does that or if it doesn't. And then they enter some kind of way to survive the winter or a period of time when the host isn't available. So that's the generalized disease cycle that we're thinking about when we're thinking about disease management. And when you're managing a disease, like Eric said, it's really important to correctly identify what's happening. What is causing that disease? There are many symptoms that can be caused by different types of pathogens, but they can mimic each other. So knowing what you're fighting is the first step to successfully managing that disease. So know what is normal for your host. Look for symptoms, look for patterns in the plant, look for patterns in the field. All of these things can provide you with clues on whether it's a pathogen or something in the environment or something else. And then you can check for something called signs, which is basically just the pathogen itself. You might see the spores or the collection of the spores being produced. Consequences of a wrong diagnosis, this is why knowing your enemy is so important, is you might spray something unnecessarily. You might spray something too early before the problem is even worth spraying for. Another problem is you might misdiagnose it and say the pathogen isn't there when it really is. And maybe it's a high-risk pathogen like late blight that moves very quickly and you need to nip that in the bud early. This could lead to very much more serious consequences. I'm not going to go over the principles of disease management because we're out of time, but there are different things that we are using, eradication, exclusion, eradication. You've heard of the pale cyst nematode. We're using an eradication method to try to get rid of that. Exclusion is a quarantine type thing that we could use. That's a tool. Let's see, protection is when you think of protection, you think of chemicals. Chemicals are something that can protect the plant. It doesn't have to be a chemical. Maybe it's a physical or spatial or temporal strategy. Maybe you're managing the vector of a disease. Eric mentioned PBY and leaf roll. And as Pam mentioned, always read the label. And they both alluded to pesticide resistance. That's a thing. So when you're using these pesticides, always read the label, and often there's information on how to implement a resistance management plan, so you're not putting selection pressure on your target and increasing a problem down the road.